I never asked to be the family archivist. Truthfully, I never even considered myself sentimental. But when my mother died and the house became a mausoleum of unspoken things, it fell to me to lift the layers of dust that time and silence had lovingly buried, as though ignoring the past would somehow keep the pain contained in cardboard boxes and yellowing photo albums, each one a grenade with the pin still in. I suppose I said yes because no one else wanted to. My sister had vanished years ago, citing her sanity as too fragile to stay tethered to our bloodline, and the few remaining cousins were more interested in the inheritance than the history. So I returned to the old family home alone, a single key trembling in my hand. As I stood in the foyer that smelled of lemon polish and old grief, the wallpaper curling like aging skin, the floorboards groaning with every reluctant step forward, and I remember thinking, maybe foolishly, that this would be a cleansing act, that honoring the memory of our lineage might offer some catharsis, some quiet resolution to a lifetime of half-heard stories and emotional minefields. But the moment I climbed into the attic, where the air was thick with insulation dust and dead insects and that peculiar scent of moldy paper and time-worn fabric, I knew something was waiting for me up there, something that hadn't breathed in decades but still pulsed with a kind of desperate anticipation. And as I began the task, methodical at first, like a surgeon laying out instruments, I arranged the boxes by date and handwriting, some scrawled in my father's heavy hand, some delicate and neat like my mother's, some anonymous entirely, and with every lid I opened, the memories came spilling out like blood from a reopened wound. My father's war medals, forgotten in a box beneath a stack of utility bills, my mother's college notebooks, filled with pressed flowers and meticulous notes about British literature, a folder of family recipes, annotated, with fading ink and grease-stained fingerprints that brought tears to my eyes not for food, but for the countless Sunday dinners where no one said what they truly meant, where laughter was loud enough to drown out everything that needed to be said. I found photographs, hundreds of them, some framed in cheap metal edges, others loose in envelopes marked, "Do not discard." And they told stories I barely remembered living. Me as a toddler on my father's shoulders, my sister holding a sparkler on. The 4th of July, my mother wearing that same pained smile that seemed to stretch just short of reaching her eyes. Every photo a ghost, every memory a betrayal to present. And the deeper I went, the more I began to realize that our family history wasn't a linear story, but a fragmented novel missing whole chapters. Names I didn't recognize, children who appeared once a photo and never again, letters addressed to strangers with our last name, as though parts of our lineage had been redacted from the narrative, erased not by accident but intention. And through it all, I felt like I was assembling a jigsaw puzzle with missing pieces, each discovery offering a false sense of progress toward an image that might never be complete. Then one day, after nearly 2 weeks of excavating the attic, I found it, not hidden, not buried, just sitting there at the back of the room like it had always been waiting for me to notice. A simple cardboard box sealed with a thick band of black. Electrical tape, not labeled with a year or an occasion like the others, but instead with a name written in red marker. Eliza, a name I'd never heard spoken in our house, not even whispered, and yet it sent a shiver down my spine like an echo of a dream I'd forgotten upon waking, and I stared at it for what felt like hours, not daring to touch it, not yet, just feeling the oppressive weight of its presence, as though the air itself resisted me getting any closer. And I remember standing up too, fast, knocking over a stack of books, and the noise was so loud in that cramped attic that it startled me into something between panic and shame, as if I had disturbed a ritual that should have remained untouched, as if the house itself was warning me. And I told myself I'd look inside it tomorrow, that I needed more context, that I was being paranoid. But that night, and the nights that followed, I dreamed of that box. Not its contents, but the box itself, looming in corners of my dreams, appearing behind closed doors, resting at the foot of my bed, and I'd wake up drenched in sweat with the sound of my name being spoken just once, low and deliberate, and always by a woman's voice I didn't recognize yet somehow felt familiar. So I busied myself with everything else, unpacking more boxes, cataloging photographs, digitizing old videotapes where voices in the past echoed too clearly, too intimately, and I began to notice something. I was changing, subtly but undeniably. My appetite shrank, my hands trembled even at rest, and there were moments I'd catch my reflection and not recognize myself, like I'd been peeling away a version of me I'd inherited rather than chosen, and all the while the box sat there, untouched, but not ignored, because it began to feel like it was watching me, and I know how that sounds. But I swear the air around it felt warmer, heavier, more still, as though it created its own gravity, pulling at the edges of my resolve. And then I started hearing things, not in the attic, but in my mind. Words that didn't make sense, phrases like, "You're supposed to be hers," and "we did what we had to," like static breaking through otherwise coherent thought. And once I found myself holding the box without realizing I had moved, my fingers tracing the red ink of the name Eliza over and over, like a rosary of regret. And in that moment I knew this wasn't about history anymore. It was about identity, about understanding something vital that had been kept from me, not for my safety, but for someone else's comfort. And that scared me more than anything. The idea that I had been living a story written by people who never gave me the full script, and maybe that's why I finally sat down one night, alone in the attic, the lamp casting long shadows across the room like reaching arms, and placed the box on my lap, staring at it until tears welled in my eyes without warning, because I realized what I feared most wasn't what I'd find inside. It was what it might confirm about who I really was, or who I wasn't, and how maybe, just maybe, everything I believed about love, loyalty, and blood was built on a foundation of silence. And it was in that silence, heavy and suffocating, that I finally peeled back the first strip of tape and heard, or imagined I heard, the faintest sigh from the box, like it, too, had been waiting for this moment far longer than I had. After I peeled back the first line of tape on that box, I didn't open it. Not yet, not fully, but it had already opened something in me, some unseen fracture running to the core of my understanding. And for reasons I still can't explain, I stepped away and spent the next 2 days combing through the other boxes again. Not searching for anything in particular, just delaying, distracting, detouring, as though I could build up a tolerance for pain before letting the real blow land. And what I found in those 2 days began to redraw the borders of my family in quiet, horrifying increments. It started with photographs, ordinary, unlabeled, but wrong in the way a dream is wrong. Familiar until you focus too hard. And I noticed in more than one picture a girl I didn't recognize. Sometimes beside my mother, sometimes beside my father, always smiling too broadly for someone I had no memory of. And yet she was there, Easter, 1988, next to the eggs dyed too dark. Thanksgiving, 1990, arms around my sister, who looked younger, smaller, more fragile than I remembered. I flipped through dozens of pictures, and the girl was always there, aging like the rest of us, but not appearing in any of the framed photos in the hallway downstairs, not in any of the albums kept in the living room cabinet, as though she'd been erased only from the parts of our lives that guests might see. And I would have thought it was a cousin, a friend, someone peripheral, except one photo changed that, a school picture, one of those classic ones with a fake bookshelf background and a forced smile, and in neat cursive on the back, written in my mother's unmistakable hand, were the words, Eliza, grade 3, top of her class just like her dad. And I sat there for 10 full minutes just staring at that name, Eliza, like seeing it in ink made it more real than the box did, and it raised more questions than it answered. Why had I never heard of her, never seen her picture, never listened to a story about her at Christmas like I had about every other relative? Even the disgraced ones, the jailbirds, the drunks, the liars. Because at least they had names and stories. But Eliza was a ghost embedded in the wallpaper of our lives. And once I saw her, I couldn't unsee her, and I began to catalog all the references I'd ignored before. The old family chart where a line ended abruptly. The letter I once found from my mother to E that I thought was about an aunt. The time my sister snapped at me when I asked about a woman in a photo. She's nobody, she said too fast. And now the silence took on a shape, and it terrified me, because it meant the silence had been deliberate, that this wasn't forgetfulness or tragedy or loss, but an erasure, a wiping clean of someone who had once mattered enough to have school portraits and holiday photos and notes in my mother's voice. And the deeper I dug, the more tangled the web became. I found a sealed envelope addressed to my father in a box of unrelated papers, marriage licenses, tax records, faded theater tickets, and the letter inside wasn't signed, but the handwriting matched the photo caption. It was Eliza writing to him, saying she was sorry for what she said the last time they spoke, asking him to please just write back, just once, even if it was only to say he was done. And the language in the letter didn't feel like that of a child or a niece or even a daughter. It felt intimate in a way that made my stomach churn. Not romantic, no, but deep, bonded, like a rope stretched in between two cliffs trying not to snap. And I began to wonder if Eliza wasn't someone on the outskirts of our family story, but right at the heart of it. And I kept asking myself the same question over and over: why erase her? And I didn't yet know the answer, but I began to suspect that whatever Eliza had done or had been, it had threatened the fragile scaffolding that held our family together. And so they cut her out like a cancer, only they forgot that memories don't stay buried, they ferment, and I started making calls, not out of bravery, but desperation, and every call only made things worse. My Aunt Joan hung up the moment I asked about Eliza. My Uncle Marvin said, "I don't know anything about that," and changed the subject to church fundraisers. And my cousin Leah, the only one I ever trusted, paused a little too long before saying, "I don't think you should be digging into this. It won't help," which sounded more like a warning than concern. And when I pressed her, really pressed her, she just said, "Eliza wasn't who you think she was," and then went quiet in that way people do when they're waiting for you to give up. And maybe I would have if I hadn't found a home video. It was labeled simply Summer 91 and showed our backyard, me running to the sprinkler, my sister yelling at someone behind the camera to zoom in, and then Eliza, again, older now, sitting on a lawn chair with sunglasses and paperback, and my mother beside her, laughing real laughter, the kind I hadn't heard in years. And for a split second, it felt like a glitch in the simulation, like I had stepped into an alternate life, one where Eliza wasn't erased, where she was a sister or a cousin or a friend who mattered. And when I paused the video and stared at her face, I realized with kind of cold finality that she looked like me, not just similar, but unmistakably like me, in the way strangers on the street sometimes look twice at you and say, "Don't I know you?" And that's when it hit me. Eliza wasn't someone who left a family. She was someone who had to be removed from it. And the reason for that had nothing to do with scandal or shame or sin, but with something much worse. The kind of truth that shakes the foundation of a person's identity. And though I didn't know it yet, I had already started slipping down the slope toward that truth, losing my grip on the idea of who I was and who I came from, and still, I hadn't opened that last box all the way, because even as the question screamed louder in my ears, something in me held back, instinct maybe, or fear, or some deep ancestral understanding that once the lid came off, nothing could ever go back to the way it was. Not just a family, but me. And so I stayed in the attic night after night, surrounded by paper and silence and names that no longer felt like just names, but keys to a locked room inside myself. And one of those long hours, with rain tapping the roof and my coffee gone cold, I whisper Eliza's name aloud for the first time, just to hear how it sounded in my voice, and the air shifted, not in a ghost story way, but in a grief way, the way rooms do when you remember too hard. And it was then I realized that if Eliza was the missing piece, then everything I thought was whole in my life, every memory, every photo, every bedtime story and lullaby, had been incomplete, and that thought broke something in me. Because you can survive tragedy, but you can't survive the feeling that your life was built on someone else's loss, someone else's exile, and all at once, I understood that the truth wasn't waiting in that last box. It had already begun bleeding out of everything around it, and I was no longer the family archivist preserving stories. I was a grave digger unearthing the one story they tried to keep buried with everything that it was almost by accident that I found the letters, if such things are ever accidents, tucked away not in the attic with the rest of the boxes, but inside a hollowed-out encyclopedia on the bottom shelf of the hallway bookcase, one of those. Thick, dusty tomes no one had touched in decades, and it struck me even then, before I read a single word, that someone had wanted them hidden but not destroyed, as though part of them wanted to be found eventually, when the person doing the finding was old enough or broken enough to understand, and when I pulled the brittle pages from their hiding place, yellowed and paper-clipped together in no discernible order, my heart raced with sick anticipation, because I knew these weren't ordinary correspondences, not with the way they were folded, not with the way they were pressed flat like fossils, as if the weight of the years could keep them from whispering their secrets. And when I opened the first one and saw my mother's handwriting, the unmistakable cursor with the slight upward slant at the end of every Y and G, my chest tightened with something close to grief, but not quite, more like betrayal laced with mourning, and I started to read, my eyes, devouring her words with the desperation of a child eavesdropping on an adult conversation they weren't supposed to hear. It was only after the first paragraph that I understood who she was writing to, not my father, not my sister, not some estranged cousin or friend, But Eliza, the name once written in red ink on a sealed box, now whispered like a confession in every letter. And the letters didn't start off angry or cold, but warm, deeply maternal. The kind of warmth I hadn't known my mother was capable of expressing in ink. "I made you scrambled eggs the way you like them, with too much butter," she wrote. "And you wouldn't eat until I sang that ridiculous song from Carousel. And I sat there stunned because I remembered that song, the one she hummed when she brushed my hair, and suddenly I couldn't breathe, because it dawned on me she didn't write that song for me," and each letter dug deeper, slipping from affectionate into anxious, then wounded, then near hysterical, like A, descend into emotional quicksand. And they weren't dated, but I could trace their order by tone. The way her penmanship got shakier, the sentences more fragmented, the crossings out more frantic, and I began to sense a story told in reverse, a relationship that had started close and loving but became unsteady, burdened, and finally severed by something neither of them could speak about directly. And some of the letters were responses, handwritten in a different script, sharper, angrier, accusatory. Eliza's, I assumed, and they were harder to read, not just because of the emotional violence, but because they sounded like me when I was young, or maybe not me, but someone I could have been, and one of the notes broke me entirely. "You lied to me." It read, "You promised you'd never do what they did to you." And below that, scratched out, but still legible if you tilted the paper in the light, were the words, "You stole my name." And I sat with that letter in my lap for what felt like hours, unable to move, because it didn't feel like reading. It felt like being read, like these letters were dissecting me, not the other way around. And I could escape the sickening possibility that I was the reason Eliza had been erased, that her removal from the family story was an act of survival for someone, maybe everyone, except her, and the guilt began to settle in my bones like a cold draft I couldn't block out. And I thought of all the times my mother looked at me with an expression I couldn't place, a sort of strained tenderness I'd mistaken for love, but now wondered if it was grief for the daughter she silenced, or grief for the part of herself she buried with her, and one of the later letters confirmed it, though not directly. "You wouldn't understand yet," she wrote, "but I did what I had to do to keep you safe, to give you a life that wasn't poisoned by the past." And in that moment, something inside me shifted, a tectonic rumble of realization. I wasn't just the archivist of this family's past. I was a consequence of it. And I thought of my sister, who always kept her distance, who never hugged me as tightly as she did other people, who once said, in a moment of cruelty, "You wouldn't understand, you weren't there." And now I realized I wasn't supposed to be there, not originally, not in the way I believed. And as I kept reading, the weight of every sentence began to fracture the carefully constructed mythology I'd carried all my life. Birthday, parties, lullabies, scraped knees, and soft apologies, all suddenly suspect, all reframed in the context of this desperate, hidden correspondence between a mother and a daughter on opposite sides of the chasm neither of them could cross. And the worst part, the part one can barely admit even now, was that a part of me envied Eliza, envied the way my mother wrote about her, the vividness of the memories, the emotional urgency, the rawness, the honesty, because what I had gotten in my life was muted, measured, filtered through the lens of fear and guilt, while Eliza got the unvarnished, messy truth. And in a twisted way, I began to wonder which of us was more real to my mother, the daughter she erased, or the one she reinvented, and the question festered, feeding off every word I read, until finally I reached a letter so painful, so emotionally eviscerating that I couldn't breathe as I read it. It wasn't written to Eliza, but about her, and it was never meant to be sent, just a page torn from a journal and hidden among the others, and in it, my mother confessed, "I look at her and I see you, and I don't know if that's a blessing or punishment, but every day I wonder if I did the right thing, if giving you up to save you was just cowardice dressed as love." And I dropped the page, my hand shaking, and for the first time I said it aloud, "She gave her up?" And the attic seemed to go still, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. And I thought, what else did she hide? What did my father know? What did my sister witness? And it became clear that the only way to move forward was to go back, to piece together the real story from a fragment of pain and lies and half-buried truths. But I couldn't shake the feeling that every discovery only made things worse, because for every answer I found, two more questions bloomed in its place. And as I laid the letters out on the floor in the shape of a timeline, trying to map the decay of a relationship, I felt like I was performing an autopsy on a living memory, and I wasn't sure if I was trying to resurrect the truth or bury it properly this time. But either way, I knew the next step was the one I'd been avoiding all along. I had to open the last box completely, not just to find what was inside, but to find out why it had been sealed so tightly, why it had waited until now to be opened, and what version of myself I'd be when I finally saw the truth written not in letters or photographs, but in the cold, clinical ink of documents that didn't lie. That couldn't. After reading the letters, I couldn't look at the house the same way. It didn't feel like a structure anymore, not just walls and beams and chipped paint and dust-lined windows, but something living, something watching, not in a ghost story way, but in the way old places absorb energy, hold it like breath, and release it slowly when no one's looking. And as I walked the rooms I had known since childhood, they felt unfamiliar, like they were rearranging themselves in the periphery of my vision, shifting out of the way to what I'd uncovered, and I began to notice things I'd never questioned before. The narrow hallway on the second floor with a door that had always been locked, the tiny scorch mark near the baseboard of the living room where my mother said lightning once struck, the loose floorboard in the guest room that I used to trip over, but had somehow forgotten existed until I stepped on it again and felt that same eerie give, that hollow thud, and as I knelt to pry it loose, my hands trembling not from fear, but from some half-formed anticipation, I found what had been hidden there. Not another letter, but a single shoe, tiny, child-sized, worn at the heel, with a tag inside that read Eliza J., Room 112, and I held it in my lap for what felt like hours, because I knew this wasn't mine, wasn't my sister's. It belonged to a girl who no longer existed in this house, and the way it had been buried, tucked into bones of place, felt cruel, intentional, like someone couldn't bear to throw it away, but also couldn't stand to see it, and that contradiction echoed in me like a second heartbeat, because the house had always been full of strange contradictions. My mother's bedroom, always locked when she wasn't in it, but unlocked at night with the lamp on, casting shadows that stretched into the hallway like reaching arms. The linen closet with the bottom shelf missing, where I used to hide during hide and seek, and once found an empty baby bottle with a broken nipple. The attic door that groaned in the winter, even when no one was near it. I used to tell myself, these were quirks, features of an old home left to settle into its age, but now they felt like symptoms of something else, like the house itself had been trying to hold its breath for decades, waiting for me to ask the right questions. And I walked room to room like I was stepping through a dream, but the memories came sharp and fast, like glass underfoot. One in particular. I was 6, crying in the kitchen with a scraped knee, and my mother kissed it absent-mindedly and said, "You never used to cry this much." And I remember thinking that was a strange thing to say, but now I realized she wasn't talking to me. Not really, and I started to suspect the house had heard everything, all the secrets, all the screams, all the silences that had buried truth under layers of politeness and tradition. And I thought about the basement, a place I had avoided for years not out of fear, but because of how cold it always felt, like a draft that didn't come from any vent. And when I finally forced myself to go down there, flashlight in hand, I saw the space for what it was, a kind of purgatory for discarded things. Boxes of canned food from the Y2K scare, broken furniture, old toys whose batteries had long since corroded. But in the far back corner, half buried behind a rusted filing cabinet, was a folded crib, white paint flaking, slats loose, with a faded name sticker on a headboard that read EJ. And I crouched in front of it, the light shaking my hand, and I whispered the name aloud. Eliza. And the silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was expectant, like something waiting to exhale. And in that moment, I remembered something I hadn't thought of in years. A night when I was around 8, my father was yelling in the garage, and I crept down the stairs, heart pounding, and heard him say, "I told you we should have told her by now." And my mother, through clenched teeth, replied, "And ruin everything? She's ours now. That's all that matters." And I had convinced myself they were talking about money, about some adult thing I couldn't grasp. But now those words echoed in my head like prophecy, and I began to wonder how many memories I had misfiled, how many times I had heard the truth wrapped in euphemism and didn't realize it. And I returned to the hallway door upstairs, the one that was always locked, and found the old brass key still in my father's study drawer. And when I turned in the lock, the click sounded like a verdict, and the door swung open to reveal a tiny room I hadn't seen since I was small, a room with peeling wallpaper printed with moons and rabbits, a room with a rocking chair in the corner, and faint marks on the floor where something heavy had once stood. A crib, maybe. And on the windowsill, under a thick coat of dust, was a music box, cracked at the hinge, and when I wound it, it played a lullaby I didn't recognize, but felt in my bones, and as it played, I sat in that chair, overwhelmed by the sense that I wasn't discovering anything new, just remembering things I had been made to forget. And I thought again of the photos where Eliza appeared and the ones where she didn't, the edited memories, the silent meals, the times my mother stared at me as if searching for someone else's face. And I realized the house wasn't haunted by spirits. It was haunted by omissions, by the weight of unsaid things, by the passive violence of emotional revisionism. And I felt suddenly like I couldn't breathe, like the walls were closing in, not physically, but emotionally, as though the structure itself was trying to tell me something it held for too long. And I stumbled out of the room, down the stairs, and into the backyard where I sat in the overgrown grass and tried to remember a single moment from my childhood that hadn't been tainted by this truth, and I couldn't not anymore, because once you see the cracks, you can't unsee them, and I realized with a hollow ache that the house hadn't changed at all. It was me who had shifted, and everything around me had been trying to hold that version of reality together. The lie, the neatness, the script written to keep me content and contained. And now that I had stepped outside of it, I couldn't go back in without feeling like an intruder in someone else's story. And I stood there, looking up at the house where I lived, laughed, cried, celebrated holidays. And I didn't see a home anymore. I saw a monument to survival, to denial, to the terrible cost of secrets. And I knew then that I couldn't avoid it any longer. Couldn't tiptoe around the last box as if it were just another relic. Because it wasn't. It was the anchor, the keystone, the thing everything else had been orbiting around. And the house, in its own way, had prepared me for it, had whispered in creaks and shadows and silences until I was ready to hear the truth, not as history, but as blood. I didn't plan to open the box that night. I didn't even intend to go back into the attic. I had come downstairs to make tea, to calm the chaos that had been building in my chest like a rising tide of static. But something about the way the light from the hallway stretched up the staircase, pooling at the attic door like an invitation or a challenge, made me move without thinking, and suddenly I was sitting cross-legged on the attic floor with the last box in front of me, fingers hovering over the edge of the cardboard like I was about to disarm a bomb. And in many ways I was, because everything in me, every fractured memory, every letter, every ghost of Eliza's voice I thought I'd only imagined, told me that whatever lay inside wasn't just about the past, it was about me. And when I peeled back the last of the tape and lifted the flaps, I wasn't prepared for how normal it looked at first. Manila folders, a Ziploc bag with old photos, a few cassette tapes, a thin stack of yellowed medical forms, and then, at the very bottom, a sealed envelope marked in black ink. Do not open without previous consent. And I hesitated, not because I feared the consequences, but because I already knew that what I was about to read would be the end of the story I had lived up to this point, the final nail in the coffin of the identity I'd carried my entire life. And still, my hands moved, almost attached from my will, and I opened the envelope, unfolded the documents, and the first page made my stomach drop. A certificate of live birth, issued in a different state than I was told I was born in, with a name I had never seen before in my life. Jessica Eliza Jameson, and listed as mother, Eliza J. Jameson, and where the father's name should have been, it read, unavailable, and I read it again and again, as if repetition might make it make sense, might shift it into fiction. But the second page buried that hope completely. It was a court order for emergency custody transfer, dated 6 months after the birth certificate, naming my mother, the woman I had called Mom all my life, as temporary guardian, citing emotional instability and lack of family support as reasons for Eliza's removal, and the signatures at the bottom, judge, caseworker. My father felt like knives under the skin, because there was, in black and white bureaucracy, I had not been born into this family. I had been absorbed into it, repositioned, renamed, rewritten into a narrative that had no space for the mother who gave birth to me. And I stumbled, backward, knocking over the box, its contents spilling like organs onto the attic floor, and I wanted to scream, but nothing came out because the sound in my head was deafening. The dissonance of a million memories rewriting themselves in real time. Birthdays where I looked like anyone else. The whispered arguments, the careful distance between me and my sister, the stories that never quite added up, the night terrors, the gut feeling I could never explain. And now I knew why, because somewhere deep down, some part of me remembered. Even if it wasn't conscious, even if it was just the ache of something missing and unnamed. And I thought of Eliza not as a footnote in a box, not as a name written in red marker, but as a woman who lost her daughter to the silent machinery of shame and family politics, and the lies we tell ourselves to survive. And I found the photos next me, unmistakably me, as a baby in someone else's arms, not my mother, but Eliza, smiling like the sun, like she couldn't believe I was real. And I cried then, not soft tears, but gut-deep sobs that shook my whole body, because I recognized that look, had always yearned for it, and I had spent my entire life searching for it in the wrong woman's eyes, and it had been there all along, in a photo hidden at the bottom of a box no one wanted me to open, and beneath the photo was cassette tape labeled, "To her, if she ever finds this." And I didn't listen to it yet. I couldn't, not then, not with my hands. Still shaking and my entire sense of self sliding out from under me like loose gravel. Because what do you do when you realize you were someone else's secret? Someone else's heartbreak? Someone else's beginning and ending? All at once. I paced the attic, then the hallway, then the kitchen like I could outrun it, but everywhere I turned, there were echoes, shadows of the lie I'd lived. The lullabies my mother sang that weren't hers. The stories she told that stopped just short of certain years. The way she would flinch when I asked about where I was born, why there were no baby books of me before age 2, why I didn't look like anyone else in family photos, and all those deflections had seemed like quirks before, but now they formed a pattern, a wall of deliberate omissions, and betrayal tasted bitter in my throat. Not because I was unloved, but because I was unclaimed, because I had spent my life as the living proof of someone else's guilt and someone else's grief, and they had chosen silence over honesty, chosen comfort over truth. And it wasn't enough to say they raised me. It wasn't enough to say they loved me, because they had stolen something from Eliza, something sacred, and whether she had broken or failed or suffered, she had been erased, and I had been complicit, unknowingly, in that erasure. And I wondered what she thought of me, where she was, if she was alive, if she hated me, if she prayed for me, if she kept an empty room in her heart in case I ever came back. And I thought about calling my sister, demanding answers. But what could she say? That she remembered me arriving in the middle of the night, that she was told never to speak of Eliza again, that she played along because children do what they're told, and then grow up broken and don't know why. I stood at the sink, gripping the edge, staring at my reflection in the dark window, and I didn't recognize myself, not because I looked different, but because now I knew the story behind that face. Wasn't the one I'd been told, and I whisper my name, not the one I'd lived with, but the one on the birth certificate, Jessica, and it felt foreign, but right, like a scar healing in reverse. And I knew then I couldn't go back, couldn't pretend this was some small secret to tuck away again, because the moment the box opened, the box inside me opened, and it would never close again. The days that followed felt like a dream without shape, not a nightmare exactly, but the kind of dream where nothing makes sense, and you can't remember how you got from one room to the next, and time bent in strange ways. Sometimes I'd stare at the ceiling for hours without realizing the sun had gone down. Other times I'd blink and whole mornings vanish into nothing, and I think I was grieving, not just for Eliza or for the life I never had, but for the version of me that no longer existed, the version that had certainty, even if it was based on lies, and in her absence, a new self began to form. But she was weak and unsure, brittle at the edges like a glass sculpture pressed into someone else's mold. And I couldn't stop repeating the name, Jessica, like a mantra, like a question, like an incantation to summon the ghost of the girl I once was but never knew. And it didn't feel natural on my tongue, but it didn't feel wrong either. It felt possible, like an old coat pulled from a closet that still somehow fit. And I found myself writing it over and over in my notebook, sometimes pairing it with the last name Jameson, sometimes just the initial J, testing it, tasting it, try to see where it belonged inside me. And in the silence of the house, I played back moments from childhood like scratch film reels. My 5th birthday when I cried because I didn't want to wear the red dress, the way my mother, no, the woman who raised me, hesitated before comforting me, like she didn't know the script. Or my 7th Christmas when I got the wrong Barbie, and my sister said, "You were supposed to want the other one." And I hadn't known what that meant, but now I wondered if she had been speaking to someone else through me, someone who'd come before, and I started questioning everything, not just the memories, but the emotions tied to them. Was my laughter real or rehearsed? Were the smiles I saw genuine or masks? And the guilt began to rise in my throat like bile, because I realized I had lived a life meant for someone else, not by choice, not out of malice, but because I had been too young to know I was a placeholder in someone else's family photo. And the thought gutted me, not just because of what it meant for Eliza, but because of what it meant for me, that I had never truly been seen, only accepted under conditions I never agreed to, loved in silence, raised in shadows. And I began to understand the weight of being a secret, how it hollowed you out even if you didn't know it, how it shaped your spine, made you shrink yourself to fit the space someone else carved for you. And I started to unravel in small ways, forgetting to eat, forgetting to shower, losing time scrolling through public records, trying to piece together what happened to Eliza. After I was taken, and the more I searched, the more I felt like chasing a ghost through a fog. There were court records, but no follow-ups, a few medical forms from a public hospital, a single psychiatric evaluation that ended in a recommendation for outpatient treatment and reunification, if conditions improve. And then nothing, no obituary, no marriage license, no employment record, like she had been dropped from the system or had dropped herself. And I wondered if she had changed her name, too, if she had shed her skin like I had mine. Only hers had been torn off and mine had been handed to me wrapped in warmth and lies. And I began recording voice memos to her, not because I knew where to send them, but because I had to speak, had to let the words out or risk being consumed by them. And I'd sit in the hallway where the acoustics made my voice echo and say things like, "Did you look for me? And did you know they renamed me? And was I a good baby? And once, I'm sorry I was taken." And I broke down after that one, because I felt like a thief, a daughter-shaped thief who had inherited the good silver and the family name and the Sunday dinners and never even realized it. And I wanted to scream at someone, my mother, my father, the judge, the social worker, but there was no one to punish, only the silence they left behind. And I tried calling my sister again, and this time she answered, but when I said the name Eliza, she went quiet, then whispered, "You know now, don't you?" And I said yes, and she exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for years and said, "They told me you forget her, that kids always forget." And then she cried, real ugly sobs that made me feel sick, and I asked her why no one ever told me, and she said, "Because they loved you too much to risk losing you again." And I screamed at her, "But she lost me." And she didn't say anything after that, just hung up, and I knew then that love in our family had always been transactional, conditional, built on sacrifice disguised as care, and I started pulling away from everything. I stopped returning texts, stopped opening emails, stopped answering the door, and the isolation felt like both punishment and penance, like the world was holding its breath with me, waiting for me to decide who I was now. And I kept looking at the tape, the one labeled to her, "If she ever finds this." And I couldn't bring myself to play it, because what if it was a goodbye? What if it was proof that she had given up? What if she begged me to forgive her and I couldn't? So I kept it on the desk, staring at me like a dare, and instead I searched for her in other ways. I joined forums, posted anonymously, searched for any trace of Eliza Jameson in county databases, library indexes, even old school yearbooks. And each dead end felt like a slap, a reminder that I had lost her twice, once as a child, and now as an adult, to time, to silence, to the institutional erasure of women like her, women who were failed by systems and families, and then blamed for breaking under the weight of it. And I felt anger then, a deep, scalding anger that settled in my chest like a bruise, not just at the people who took me from her, but at the world that let it happen, that normalized it, that convinced everyone it was for the best. And I wanted to rewrite history, to scream her name in the middle of family gatherings, to tape her photo to every surface in the house, to remind them that she existed, that she loved, that she tried, even if she failed. And in the middle of that rage, I found a notebook in the bottom drawer of the attic desk, one I'd somehow missed before, and it wasn't hers. It was mine, or at least it was given to me. A childhood journal with glitter on the cover and childish drawings inside. And at the back, in someone else's handwriting, were words that made my blood run cold. She cried for her real mother in her sleep again. I told her it was just a dream. I had to. And I dropped the notebook like it burned me, because that meant I knew, on some level, even then, before I had words for it, Before memory formed its scaffolding, I remembered her, and they made me forget, and the grief that followed was too big for crying, too wide for words. It sat on my chest like a mountain, unmoving, and I finally understood that memory isn't linear. It's cellular, it's buried in skin and bone, and even when your brain forgets, your body remembers, and mine had been, remembering her all along, in dreams, in fears, in that ache I could never name. And now the ache had a name, Eliza, and so did I, Jessica, and saying aloud in that empty house felt like a rebellion and a resurrection all at once. And I whispered again and again until it no longer sounded foreign, until it sounded like me. IT was nearly a week after I started using my real name, Jessica, whispered like a wound and a weapon. That I found her journal, not hidden like the letters or box-like, the files, but placed carefully inside a hollowed-out book on the bottom shelf of my father's office, as though someone had once wanted to preserve it without making it too easy to find. And when I pulled it free, the leather binding cracked from age and neglect, but it smelled like her old paper, lavender, something unspoken, and I knew without opening it that it belonged to Eliza, because grief leaves fingerprints, and every inch of this book felt covered in them. And when I turned to the first page, I found her handwriting, looped, precise, emotional in its neatness, like someone trying to control something already spiraling. And she began simply, "I don't know who to talk to anymore." And I read that sentence over and over before moving on, because it felt like she was speaking to me, even now. Like this was a conversation I had arrived too late for, and the entries were dated, methodical at first, like someone trying to log the weather of a collapsing world. She wouldn't. "Stop crying this morning. I think she's teething. I wish someone would tell me if I'm doing this right." And I felt that in my chest like a stone, not because it was poetic, but because it wasn't. It was plain, real, full of the awful vulnerability of a young mother slipping beneath the weight of expectations she was never prepared for, and her words were honest in a way that made my throat close. Sometimes I look at her and I can't believe she came from me. Sometimes I look at her and I feel like a stranger is watching me through her eyes, and I flinch because I had felt that too, that unexplainable distance between mother and child, and now I knew why. Because that distance was never meant to exist, and as I read on, the entries grew darker, thinner, more fragmented, as if her mind was becoming a room with too many doors open and not enough light. I dropped her today. Not far, just a few inches. She cried for 2 minutes and then stopped. I cried for an hour, and I had to put the book down, step away, because reading her unraveling felt like watching someone drown in slow motion and knowing you were the water. And I came back to it later, at night, when the house was quiet and I could light a single candle and pretend this was a ritual, not a reckoning. And the pages began to fold in on themselves, the handwriting slanting harder, words crossed out then rewritten, apologies mid-sentence. I told them I'm fine. I'm not. I haven't slept in days. She cries in my dreams. I wake up holding air, and the ache in me sharpened, because I saw in her what no one else had. The desperation not of a monster or a failure, but a woman begging for help in the only language she had left, written confession. And then, suddenly, a gap, a missing month, then 2, and when the entries resumed, the tone had changed entirely, colder, resigned. They said I'm unfit. They're sending someone next week. I told them I'd do better. I will do better. Please. And beneath that, a line drawn so hard the pen had bled to the page, and then nothing for weeks, and I imagined her sitting in a small room with no one listening, writing letters to a future that may never arrive. And when the entries returned, they were no longer journal-like, but letters written to me. "Jessica, if you ever read this, I want you to know it wasn't your fault." And I froze, the journal shaking in my hands, because she had named me, not the name I had lived with, but the name she had given me, as though even after they took me, she believed in the possibility of return. And I read every letter like scripture. I used to sing to you. I don't know if you remember that. I'd sit by the window and hum that old song about the bluebird, and you'd stop crying. You always stopped crying when I sang, and tears streamed down my face because I did remember that melody, not consciously, not in full, but as a comfort, a pattern, something my mind hummed on quiet mornings when the world felt heavy and the next letter gutted me. They told me you'd be better off without me, that you'd be safer. I was so tired. I said yes. I thought I'd get you back. But the silence came instead. The years came instead. I'm so sorry, baby girl. And I held the journal to my chest and sobbed, not for myself, but for the version of Eliza who had no one to hear these words but the page, who had been punished for unraveling, who had been erased for being human. And I wanted to scream at the world that took her child and called it rescue, at the family who tucked her into the margins and never once said her name again. And the final pages of the journal were barely legible, water damaged, smudged ink, but I could still make out fragments. I still buy her birthday card every year. And maybe if I move, she'll find me. And love doesn't disappear even when you do. And the last line she wrote was simple, I hope you forgive me. And I sat with that for hours, because I didn't know if I could, not because I hated her, but because I hated that I never got to know her, that I had spent my life adrift, calling someone else mom, while the woman who brought me into this world wrote letters to avoid, and I thought of all the versions of my life that never happened. The ones where she held me through the night, where we learned together, failed together, survived together. And though I knew there were reasons, mental illness, fear, family rejection, I also knew this. She had never stopped trying. Not really. Not when it mattered. And I couldn't hate her for breaking, because she had broken in the shape of love. And I realized then that I wasn't reading her descent. I was reading her fight, her refusal to vanish completely, her way of leaving a breadcrumb trail for a daughter she had every reason to believe was lost forever, and that journal was her map. And I would follow it, even if it led nowhere, because I owed her that much, because I needed to find her not just for answers, but for her, for the chance to look her in the eyes and say, I'm here now, even if it was too late, even if the damage couldn't be undone, because forgiveness isn't about erasing pain, it's about honoring it, living beside it. And I would carry her words with me like scripture, because that year she disappeared wasn't the year I lost a mother. It was the year I became one. And no one ever told me. IT took me 3 days to gather the courage to press play. 3 days of circling that old cassette tape like it might detonate if touched too carelessly. 3 days of wondering what kind of voice would emerge from it. If it would sound like me, if it would sound like someone I could have loved, someone who might still be out there loving me in silence. And when I finally slid the tape into the portable player I'd found buried in a storage drawer, its buttons worn smooth by time and use, I did so with trembling fingers, knees drawn to my chest on the attic floor like a child awaiting punishment or a revelation too large for language. And the moment I pressed play, there was nothing, just the crackle of old tape hiss, the soft churn of mechanical memory turning over itself, and then faintly, breath, long and hesitant, like someone trying not to cry. And then a voice, her voice, richer than I imagined, deeper than my own, edged with fatigue and a kind of cautious hope. And she said, if you're listening to this, then I guess they didn't keep everything from you. And I gasped, not because of what she said, but because I could feel her, in the room with me, the warmth of her syllables hanging in the air like perfume left behind on a scarf. And she continued, I don't know how much you've learned. I don't know if you hate me. I wouldn't blame you if you did. And the tape whirred softly as she shifted, and I could hear something clink in the background, maybe a glass, maybe keys, and it grounded me in the intimacy of her space, a space I had never been welcome in and yet now occupied like a trespasser or a returning child. And her voice cracked a little as she said, I never wanted to leave you. I want that to be the first thing you know. They said I couldn't keep you safe, and maybe they were right. Maybe I was too broken, but I would have tried. God, I would have tried until my last breath. And I pressed my palm over my mouth to keep from sobbing too loudly, not wanting to miss a single word, because this was the kind of truth people wait lifetimes to hear and never do. And I had it right here, the gift and curse of being seen, of being claimed by someone who had lost everything, and her words became less structured, more like A. Journal read aloud. I used to sing to you, Sweet Baby Blue. Remember that? You'd hum it in your sleep. They told me you forget, but I think we remember the people we come from, even if no one tells us who they are. And I did remember it, or maybe I invented that memory to comfort myself. But it didn't matter, because a connection had been made, was being made in real time across a divide that no longer felt so wide. And then there was silence on the tape for a moment, the kind of silence that feels heavy, deliberate, and I imagined her pausing, collecting herself. And then came the words I never expected to hear, not in this life. I loved you. I love you still. And if there's even a piece of you that believes that, then I have done one thing right. and my chest cracked open. The pain was so deep and so pure it almost felt like relief, like finally knowing where the wound had come from gave me permission to start healing it. And her voice softened, almost like a lullaby itself. If you're older now, I hope you're happy. I hope you had someone to brush your hair and tuck you in and tell you it was going to be okay. And I thought of the woman who raised me. And I didn't feel hatred, not in that moment, just sorrow, the kind that tastes like metal in the back of your throat, because love and cruelty had walked so closely together in my life that I didn't know where one ended and the other began. And Eliza said, maybe you don't need me anymore. Maybe you build a life that makes sense. But if you ever find yourself wondering where you came from, what your name means, who held you first, I want you to know it was me. It will always be me. And there was another pause, and then her voice, just a whisper, said, I forgive you. And I broke completely then, because it had never occurred to me that she might think I needed forgiveness, that she might carry guilt for something she hadn't done, for choices made by courts and caretakers and family who had rewritten history, like it was a page they owned. And in that moment, I wanted to reach to the cassette player and pull her into the present, wanted to wrap my arms around her and say, you were enough. You didn't fail me. You were stolen from me. And the tape began to hiss again, like maybe she said all she could, and I sat there, paralyzed, unwilling to stop it, hoping there was more. And after a long breath, she spoke again, almost as if she had turned back to the microphone to say one last thing. I named you Jessica, because it means to see. I hope one day you'd see me. And the tape clicked to an end, the whirring stopped, and the room went quiet. And in that silence I sat, not as a girl I had been or the woman I was supposed to be, but as someone entirely new, rebuilt by voice and memory and forgiveness I didn't know I needed. And I closed my eyes and whispered, I see you. And for the first time in my life, I meant it, not just to her, but to myself. The morning after I heard her voice, the cadence of it still etched into the walls of my skull, the hush of her final words looping like a lullaby I'd known my whole life but never sang aloud. I sat at the kitchen table, my hand wrapped around a lukewarm mug of tea I hadn't touched, staring at nothing, the tape player beside me like a relic from another life. And I knew the silence in the house could no longer be sustained, that the ache inside me had turned from grief into necessity, a low thrum of purpose in my chest. And so I picked up the phone and dialed my sister's number again, not out of impulse this time, but with intention, because she was the only one left who'd been there, the only person who could either give me answers or stand in the way of them. And when she answered with quiet, wary hello, I said her name once, and she went silent, like she knew I wasn't called to ask how she was or to share pleasantries. And I said, I heard Eliza, and the breath she took was long and sharp and broken. And then, after what felt like a lifetime, she whispered, oh, God. And for a moment, we just existed in that shared pause, two people suspended in the wreckage of the same lie. And then I asked, why didn't you ever tell me? And her voice cracked when she said, because they made me promise. I was 8, and they told me if I ever mentioned her again, they'd send me away too. And I realized with a kind of horrifying compassion that she had been a child like me, manipulated like me, scared into compliance not because she was cruel, but because she was told silence equals safety. And I said, I deserve to know. And she said, I know. And then softly, I never forgot her either. And I asked the question that had burned in me since I found the birth certificate. Did you know she was my mother? And she said yes. And the finality in her voice didn't make me angry. It just made me sad, because she had lived with this knowledge her entire life, watching me stumble through mine without it. And I asked her if she knew where Eliza was, and she said, I might. And I felt the world shift beneath me, the axis of everything realigning, and she told me about a letter that came 10 years ago, forwarded through an old P.O. box our mother never checked, addressed only to Jessica, and my sister had opened out of curiosity or desperation or both, and inside was a return address in a coastal town several hours north. No explanation, just a date and time written in pencil and the words, if she ever wants to know the truth. And she never told anyone about it, never followed up, just tucked it away in a drawer, because what else do you do with a bomb you're not ready to detonate? But now, she said, now she wanted to help, and I didn't thank her, not out of cruelty, but because gratitude felt misplaced in a moment like that. So instead I said, I'm going. And she said, I know. And I packed a small bag that night, not because I expected to find her, not even because I was sure she'd be there, but because I had to try, Had to give that voice on the tape a body, a presence. Had to find out if that final thread between us still existed. And as I drove through winding roads and fading daylight, my mind flicked to the images I collected. Her handwriting, her journal, the photo of her holding me, the way her voice said my name like it was a prayer, and I imagined 100 versions of her. Older, frilier, stronger, colder, and none of them matched. But I didn't care, because I wasn't going for answers anymore. I was going for her, for whatever pieces of her still remained. And when I arrived in the town, a sleepy coastal place where the air tasted like salt and rust, I checked into a small motel and stared at the ceiling all night, rehearsing 1,000 ways to begin the conversation, none of which felt remotely adequate. And the next morning I stood outside the small white cottage listed in the return address, my heart hammering against my ribs, palms slick with sweat, and I raised my hand to knock but couldn't, not at first, because what do you say to a woman who gave you life and then lost everything else? But the door opened before I touched it, and there she was. Not a ghost, not a myth, not a photograph or a voice or a story, but a woman in her 60s, hair graying at the temples, eyes heavy with years, standing in a worn sweater and slippers like she'd been expecting a package, not a reckoning. And we stared at each other for a long time, and she blinked slowly and said, "Jessica?" And I nodded, and she didn't move, just pressed a hand to her mouth and began to cry, not loudly, not theatrically, just soft, broken weeping that shattered me more than any scream could have. And I stepped forward, and she stepped back to let me in, and the inside of her home was cluttered but warm. Books stacked high, a kettle on the stove, a cat curled on the couch, and we sat in silence for a while, not because we didn't know what to say, but because saying anything too soon might ruin what was real. And finally she whispered, "You look like him." And I said, "I don't know who he is." And she said, "Neither do I." And that was the first laugh we shared, low and stunned. And then I said, "I found everything. The journal, the letters, the tape." And she nodded, like she had rehearsed for this moment too many times to count. And she said, "I thought about sending more, but I didn't want to hurt you." And I said, "You didn't. You saved me." And she reached across the table and touched my hand, just lightly, and it felt like warmth returned to a place that had always been cold. And we talked, not about everything, but enough about the days before, the years between, the holes we each tried to fill with other people's truths. And I realized something as we spoke. She wasn't a stranger, not really, not in the way strangers are, because I had carried her voice inside me for longer than I knew, in my fear of abandonment, in my craving for tenderness, in my inability to trust love that came too easily. And now, seeing her in full, her face softened by time and sorrow, I didn't feel resentment. I felt recognition, the kind that blooms not in the mind but in the blood. And for the first time, I saw myself in someone's face, not abstractly, not by resemblance, but by spirit. And it didn't fix everything, didn't erase the pain or rewrite the years, but it gave me something I had never had before, a place to begin. We didn't talk much that first day, not in the way people imagine reunions should go, not with dramatic tears or accusations or desperate explanations tumbling over one another like floodwaters. There were no sweeping apologies, no collapsed embraces on the floor, no promises to start over as though time to be undone. We simply sat in the small, sun-dappled kitchen of her cottage, the kettle warming slowly, 2 cups of tea untouched between us, and let the silence stretch until it became a language of its own. And in that quiet I noticed things. The way her hands trembled slightly when she reached for the sugar, the way she glanced at me when she thought I wasn't looking, like she was still afraid I might vanish if she stared too long. And I understood that look because it mirrored the one I had seen in my own eyes in the mirror, the one that said, "I don't believe this is real. I don't believe I'm allowed to have this." And after a while, when the silence had softened into something breathable, she said, "I never imagined this moment without dreaming of all the ways it could go wrong." And I said, "It's not wrong." And that was all it took for her to cry, not loudly, not dramatically, but the kind of crying that happens when the body finally gives up holding it in. And I sat there, unsure whether to reach for her or let her be. But then she stood and walked into the other room and came back with something wrapped in a blue knitted blanket. And when she unwrapped it and placed it on the table, I realized it was a red sweater, impossibly small, faded but intact. And she said, "You wore this the day they took you." And my breath caught in my throat because I remembered it, not as a visual, but as a texture, a warmth, a sensation pressed into the deepest folds of memory, and I reached out and touched it, the yarn rough and tender under my fingertips, and said, "I always wondered why I hated wearing red." And she laughed through her tears, a soft, broken sound that filled the kitchen like sunlight, and I realized then that healing wasn't going to come in a flood. It would come in fragments, in these strange collisions of memory and object, presence and silence. And we sat for hours like that, not filling the space with explanations or digging to the past like archaeologists try and make sense of ruins, but simply being mother and daughter, however awkward, however fractured, however late. And as the day faded into a deep orange dusk, she showed me photo albums I had never seen, filled not with pictures of me, but of her, hiking with friends, working in a bookstore, painting in a class she took for 6 weeks before quitting. And it struck me how human she was, how whole, how much life had happened to her without me. And yet, in every photo, she looked slightly unfinished, like something was always missing from the frame. And I knew, just knew, that it had been me, and that knowledge didn't fill me with bitterness, but with a strange kind of peace, because it meant she had carried me too, all this time, not as guilt, but as longing. And later, after dinner, mismatched soup and bread torn too hastily, she led me down a narrow hallway to a small door at the end, one I hadn't noticed before, and she opened it and said, "This used to be your room," and the sight of it broke something wide open in me. The faded wallpaper, moons and stars, a rocking chair in the corner, a shelf still lined with a few children's books, whose pages were swollen with time, and it was clear no child had lived in this room for decades, and yet she had never turned into something else, never tried to forget or repurpose it. And I walked in slowly, as if stepping into sacred ground, and sat in the chair, rocking gently, the creak of it as familiar as breathing, and she stood in the doorway watching me, arms crossed over her chest like she was holding herself together, and I said, "Why did you keep it?" And she said, "Because I couldn't bear to let it go, because I thought maybe someday," and her voice trailed off and she looked away. But I saw the truth in her eyes, that some part of her had always known I'd return, not in body perhaps, but in some form, some echo, some presence. And I looked around the room, at the small carved box on the dresser, the stuffed rabbit missing one ear, the mobile above the window that hung still in the stale air, and I whispered, "Thank you, not for the room, not for mementos, but for keeping this piece of me safe, for remembering when everyone else had forgotten, for refusing to erase me even when she had been erased." And that night, I slept in that room, not because I wanted to relive anything, but because I wanted to give the space a new memory, one not rooted in absence. And in the dark, I listened to the sound of her house, the wind against the siding, the creak of the floorboards as she moved quietly to the kitchen, the click of the porch light turning off. And it felt like a lullaby, not the one she had sung on the tape, but a new one, a silent one made of presence and safety and breath. And when I closed my eyes, I didn't dream of red sweaters or locked boxes or names scratched out. I dreamed of her sitting beside me in a rocking chair, her hand brushing mine, her voice humming something without words. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I had arrived. I didn't leave the next day or the day after that. I stayed in the cottage with Eliza as the days softened and the silences between us grew warmer, not empty. And I spent mornings drinking tea with her on the porch, listening to the ocean roll like a steady pulse behind the dunes. And in the afternoons, we sorted through her boxes, smaller than the attic I'd emptied, but no less dense with memory. And it was there in the quiet rituals of unpacking and remembering that I began to understand something new. I was no longer uncovering the past to make sense of my own story. I was preserving it, giving it shape, dignity, space, not to be fixed, but to be witnessed. And that shift felt like healing, not in the dramatic sense of catharsis, but like a bone finally setting properly after a lifetime of misalignment. And I began documenting it all, filling notebooks and folders with dates, letters, voice memos, even sketches of rooms I remembered only as shadows of my earliest memories. And I didn't do it because I wanted revenge or closure. I did it because stories untold become absences, and I didn't want Eliza to vanish again, not even in memory. And she helped me, shyly at first, pulling down old calendars, birth announcements she'd hidden in a drawer, a list of lullabies she used to sing, a grocery list from the week before I was taken where she'd circled applesauce twice and written for Jess in the margin. And I kept all of it, even the trivial scraps, because it was all evidence, not for a courtroom, but for my soul, that I had once belonged to her, and still did, and I began assembling a new archive, not the attic of relics curated by people who tried to bury the truth, but an honest, breathing history of who we had been, who we were becoming. And it surprised me how natural it felt, how the pieces fit together even when they were jagged, how memory, once fragmented, began to flow like a current finding its course. And Eliza started writing again too, not in journals, but in short letters she handed me each morning, dated and folded like little time capsules. "Today I dreamed of your laugh," one read. "And I woke up thinking I'd heard it for real," and another, "I'm scared every day that I'll lose you again." I don't say it out loud because I know that fear doesn't belong to the present anymore, but I still carry it. And I keep each note, slide it into the growing binder of our rediscovered lives. And sometimes I'd write back, "I'm not going anywhere," or "You didn't lose me, I just had to find my way back." And there was something sacred in that quiet exchange, a conversation between two women who had once been mother and child, now becoming something more layered, more resilient, and I started digitizing cassette tape too, making copies, transcribing the words line by line, not because I feared losing the audio, but because I wanted her voice in ink, in permanence, a voice that had once existed only in absence, now printed like testimony. And I began writing the full story, not for publication, not even for an audience, but for the sake of honesty, because I had lived too long under someone else's edits, someone else's version of events. And now I had the chance to write it myself, to frame each chapter with truth instead of shame. And I included everything, not just the pain, but the beauty too, the small miracles that had gone unnoticed. The way Eliza folded napkins the same way I did, the way her hands moved when she explained something slowly, gently, like the world might break if she didn't hold it carefully. And I realized that my own tenderness had come from her, even if it had been buried under years of hardness taught by others. And I wrote about my sister too, not as a villain, but as another victim of silence, another girl who had grown up with secrets she was never equipped to carry. And slowly, the story I was writing became more than just mine, more than Eliza's. It became ours, a shared lineage of survival, of reentry, of loving through absence. And when I told Eliza I want to create a physical archive, a box with everything we'd found, everything we'd written, everything we had lived, she cried, not because it made her sad, but because no one had ever preserved her before. No one had ever said you mattered in a way that stayed. And so we built it together. The Eliza box, a simple pine container she had kept in the garage, lined with velvet, and inside we placed a red sweater, the cassette tape, the journal, the photo of her holding me, the first note she ever wrote me as an adult, and my birth certificate, the real one, and we labeled the box in ink, for her, if she ever needs to remember, and we placed it not in an attic, not in a drawer, but on a shelf in the living room, visible, intentional, unhidden, and that act, placing it in plain sight, felt like a resurrection, like breaking a cycle that had defined generations. And I realized then that archives weren't just about history. They were about belonging, about naming the people who'd been erased, and I was done erasing, done hiding, done living in a version of myself constructed to protect the fragile truths of others. And though I didn't yet know what came next, whether I would stay in that town or move back or start something new, I knew this. Wherever I went, I would carry the story not as a burden, but as proof, as a map, as something that lived in ink and blood and breath. And when I looked at Eliza now, I didn't see the woman who had lost me. I saw the woman who had waited, who had left breadcrumbs in case I ever came home, and I had followed them not with certainty, but with the kind of ache that refuses to be silenced. And now, finally, I was heard. And so was she. I and the weeks that followed, life didn't transform into some golden narrative of redemption or reconciliation. It simply unfolded quietly, in the way real life does, with slow mornings and careful conversations and the delicate reweaving of time lost and the time reclaimed. And Eliza and I fell into a rhythm that felt less like recovery and more like discovery. Two people meeting each other for the first time again, and again in small, ordinary moments. The way she left the window open at night because she liked the sound of wind, the way I hummed under my breath when I cooked, the way we both reached for the same book on the shelf without realizing it. And we didn't need to name what we were becoming. We just let it happen, let the space between us fill with presence instead of proof. And in that space, I learned that healing wasn't about forgetting or pretending nothing had been broken. It was about honoring the cracks, running your fingers along them, and saying, "I see you, and you're still here." And one afternoon, while cleaning the small shed behind her cottage, I found a dusty trunk, unlabeled, unremarkable, and sealed with 2 latches. And for a moment I felt that familiar hesitation, that pulse of dread and curiosity I had once felt in the attic of the house I used to call home. But this time was different. This time I opened it without fear, and inside were photos I had never seen before. Eliza as a teenager, smiling wide with her arms around. Friends, her holding a newborn that wasn't me. An older sibling I would later learn had been stillborn. Her in a hospital gown, holding a stuffed animal and looking exhausted but triumphant. And at the bottom, a folder of poetry, her handwriting again, softer here, full of ache and light. And I sat on the floor and read every page, tears tracing my cheeks not because the poems were sad, but because they existed, because she had once had a voice no one listened to. And now here I was listening, reading, preserving. And I brought the folder to her that night and asked if I could include the poems in the archive. And she laughed, said they were never meant for anyone to see. But when she saw the way I held them, carefully, reverently, she nodded and said, "All right for you?" And in that moment I realized I had become the archivist again, but not of silence, not of secrets. I was a keeper of her truth. And that made all the difference. And when we added the poems to the Eliza box, we didn't close it this time. We left it open on the coffee table beside a vase of wildflowers, so that every time someone visited, my sister eventually did, quietly, tearfully, they could see it, ask about it, remember, and the act of keeping it visible became our final rebellion against the generations who had equated survival with secrecy. And it occurred to me then that the first box I ever opened, the one that had begun this whole unraveling, had never really been about Eliza or the lies, or even the adoption. It had been about the cost of silence and the necessity of naming, and now here we were, at the end of that journey, sitting beside a box that held not erasure but recognition, not shame but survival. And I asked her, "What do you want people to know about you?" And she paused, looked out the window with the sea met the sky, and said, "That I was here, that I mattered." And I nodded, because that was what the last box meant now. It was her name, her face, her words, her motherhood, no longer hidden or questioned or lost. And as I placed the lid beside it, I realized I didn't need to close it, didn't need to tuck it away or label with warnings, because the story had changed, we had changed. And the last box was an ending. It was an offering, an open vessel where the truth could breathe, where the past could rest without shame. And when I finally left her cottage weeks later, I didn't feel like I was leaving anything behind. I felt like I was carrying something forward, not just the facts of what had happened, but the living proof that love can outlast abandonment, that stories can survive being buried, and that sometimes the most powerful thing we could do is open the last box and let it stay open,